Hello and welcome to this webinar from the Committee of Advertising Practice, where we'll discuss new guidance recently published, which focuses on advertising's appeal to problem gamblers and is intended to help marketers and agencies interpret CAP and BCAP's gambling rules where they relate to responsibility and problem gambling issues. I'm Sam Wilson and I work in the CAP compliance team. I'm joined by Andy Taylor from our regulatory policy team and the author of this guidance. So Andy, can you tell us a bit about this guidance when it comes into effect and what listeners can expect from this webinar?
Hi Sam. The guidance was published on the 14th of February and it comes into effect on the 2nd of April. That's the time at which the ASA will start to have regard to it when it considers individual complaints. So effectively, advertisers need to ensure that their marketing is up to speed and in line with the guidance by then. As we said, the guidance focuses specifically on this question of responsibility and particularly as that relates to people who are problem gamblers and those at risk. What we want to do here today is give you an overview of the guidance, really looking at the headline new provisions, and obviously there's an opportunity to ask questions as well.
Great, so why is the guidance being introduced now, Andy?
I think everyone knows that gambling advertising, along with gambling in a wider sense, is under heightened scrutiny. The political pressure from the review that DCMS are carrying out is an obvious point, but there's been a variety of questions asked in Parliament, newspapers and commentators making all sorts of potentially negative statements about gambling advertising, and we're responding to that within our wider aim of ensuring that we're on top of the regulation of sensitive sectors. It's an area where there's obviously considerable focus and considerable risk, and we want to ensure, firstly through this piece of guidance, that we're getting it right in relation to problem gamblers and those at risk and general responsibility, and later in the year there'll be more guidance where we focus on sort of the other half of this issue, which is to ensure that children and young people under 18s are properly protected, and I think there'll be further enforcement activity to really hammer that home.
So why has CAP chosen this approach? What does advertising guidance offer to the gambling industry?
Guidance basically steers ASA's interpretation and rules. It provides a flexible approach where we can put out more information and more pointers to advertisers to ensure that they're getting it right. This piece of guidance was developed primarily from a review of evidence, but also looking at existing ASA rulings and developing existing CAP and BCAP guidance to really sort of flesh out the position and hopefully provide as much help as possible to marketers to ensure that they're getting it right. I think there's an important balance that we need to strike with this. Gambling advertising isn't causal, it's not a significant factor in problem gambling, but of course there are what we've identified through many years of looking at gambling advertising and also looking at the evidence more recently. There are risk factors, there are things that we don't think should be in gambling advertising because the risks they pose, and we want to counter those and we want to help the industry to ensure that getting it right before they publish those ads.
So the guidance focuses on responsibility and protecting problem gamblers, as you said. How has CAP gone about making sure that vulnerable people are adequately protected, and how does this guidance help the industry to do this?
Vulnerability is an important concept. I think frustratingly in the Gambling Act, the underpinning piece of legislation to this sector, it's not particularly well defined, but it is included in certain parts of the CAP and BCAP codes. And what we've tried to do here is provide a better definition with more examples and give basically an understanding to marketers of what the ASA is like to think if they see an ad through the course of a complaints process. There isn't a direct requirement under the part of the guidance which talks about vulnerability, but what we want operators to think about is the potential vulnerabilities of their audiences and ensure that their content and their targeting approaches meet those vulnerabilities.
So let's go through some of the subjects covered in the guidance. Can you go into a bit more detail about what you mean by risk and control here?
And I think what we found from the evidence is that people's perceptions of risk, their perceptions of control, are important in terms of their decision making. And we think that advertising shouldn't play an undue role in sort of bending or slanting those perceptions in a way which could potentially cause harm. So effectively, we have sort of created a new provision which looks to balance these 2 points. On the one hand, we don't want to see approaches such as the impression or the specific claim, and sort of quite boldly that gambling is risk-free. At the same time, while it's reasonable, for example, to show a facility that gives more control to a player, they shouldn't overemphasise that. So, for instance, with cash-out facilities, obviously perfectly legitimate to have that in an ad, but as an example, it's one of those ones where marketers just need to be careful and proportionate in the way they approach it, so they don't give the impression that sort of obviates any potential risk of losing your money or suffering potential detriment.
Tell us about this next section. What is the ASA advising advertisers consider in terms of impulsiveness and urgency?
I think this is quite an important part of the guidance, and it's an important part of the evidence that we looked at. Simply put, when people are rushed, they make poor decisions, especially when they're potentially looking at doing risky activities. What we want to basically focus on here is not a prohibition. I think a lot of commentators, a lot of policymakers are talking about bet now as a potential problem. We're not banning that. We're not putting in a broad prohibition on it. What we're saying here is that in certain contexts where you have urgent calls to action or approaches that give the impression of an urgent need to act, then that type of approach is potentially problematic. So the classic example, obviously we're coming up to the World Cup in the summer, whereas it might be reasonable in a newspaper on the morning of an England game or whatever to use the claim bet now, during half time, during that an England game or whatever game, having an ad that's sort of in your face and asking you basically to make a snap decision as to whether you want to participate or not, that could potentially be a problem. It's likely to be a problem in the way in which it pushes people to act in an impulsive or urgent way.
So it's proportionate protections in there. So moving on to trivialisation, what do you mean by the section here? What should advertisers do to avoid ads being seen to trivialise gambling?
This is another important provision. I think a lot of the sort of examples that we're including here are not particularly controversial. They lock into various concerns that have existed for quite some time around problem gambling behaviours. But basically, we want operators to approach their advertising by avoiding the sort of implication that a decision to gamble is something taken lightly. It might be that the approach taken is sort of humorous and not directly intended to sort of lock into a problem gambling behaviour. But an advertiser might sort of in an untoward way depict someone spending more than they can afford. It might be an attempt at humour, but it's that type of thing where we want operators just to be very careful about the messages that they put across. And I think another particular area, promotions are very, very common in this area, and attempts to sort of win customers and so forth. I think just being careful about the sort of the message around ads where there's promotional offers, that's important. We want to avoid the implication that people should just take up offer after offer and open account after account.
So following on from that, next the guidance talks about possible indicators of problem gambling. Tell us about some of the examples discussed here and then the particular issues that advertisers should be aware of.
I think problem gambling behaviours are obviously a particular point of concern, have been for several years within the codes and the ASA's enforcement. What we tried to do here is, based on the evidence, we're trying to sort of slightly extend that from behaviours that relate directly to gambling to other behaviours that have an association with problem gambling related behaviour. And the focus here is to ensure that basically there are no indirect or unintentional, through perhaps a humorous approach that also locks into one of these behaviours. And I mean, there are several examples such as detachment or preoccupation, sort of mood swings or manipulative and dishonest behaviour. And you can quite easily see how a comedy character who is genuinely, the marketer's not intending to do anything untoward, but that type of character is sort of amusingly presented. But unfortunately, there is inherently that link to the experiences of people with problem gambling issues. And I think one of the key ones I've drawn out in the slide here is this sort of issue of zoning out or heightened emotional states. We're certainly not saying that people can't be shown to be happy or to have won or to be enjoying the act of winning, but we need to avoid situations where that goes too far and potentially locks into the behaviours associated with difficulties with problem gambling.
Some useful specific examples there. The CAP Code also states that the marketing communications must not suggest that gambling can be a solution to financial concerns, an alternative to employment, or a way to achieve financial security. How does the guidance expand on this? Are there ways that advertisers can avoid falling foul of this and similar rules in the code?
One of the things we found in the evidence is this association between money motives for gambling and heightened risk. So what we want to do with the new provisions on this issue, extending the rule that you just quoted there, Sam, is basically just instill a sense of proportion in terms of the imagery and the claims and the sort of the messages that we see in advertising. I think there is like to be a potential problem with more gratuitous depictions of wealth or sort of direct calls to action like getting rich, where the objective of that ad is to sort of push people towards participating for money motives. Again, it's about balance, it's about proportionality. So we're not saying you can't show prizes and winning or even a bit of glamour. It's about where there is too much emphasis or an unrealistic emphasis placed on the sort of the wealth, the getting rich, the money motivations behind gambling.
That's great, Andy. Hopefully listeners will find that some useful examples of how to make sure they comply with those aspects of the code. So what's next? How is CAP going to follow up on this guidance?
Well, it comes into force on the 2nd of April, as I noted at the start, and that's the point at which the ASA will start looking at the guidance when it starts looking at complaints that it receives from that date forward. So it's vitally important that this is something that marketers are having regard to now when preparing campaigns and ensuring that those ads are in line. Obviously, there's a lot to digest, to think about there. So CAP has its copy advice service, and the links are available on our website, which can assist with advice on specific campaigns and help you to get into line. So I'd encourage listeners to do that. In terms of a bit further forward, the attention's now going to shift to the question of protecting under 18s. The process and what we come out with will probably be reasonably similar to what we've done here. We're envisaging new guidance, but we have to carry out an evidence review. We have to go out and see what's there, as well as developing on newer ASA precedents that have come in since our last guidance publications. So hopefully we'll be producing a sort of a sister document to this one, which will really give much more assurity to marketers on what they need to do in order to comply with the gambling sections of the codes.
Great, and as always, we'll keep everyone up to date via our social media accounts and our website. We can move on to just a couple of questions that came in from industry members about this. The first question concerns not telling people that gambling is a way to get rich quickly. How does this tally with advertising of the National Lottery?
That's a good point, a good question. What we're trying to do is achieve a proportional balance. So as I said when we looked at that slide, we're not trying to ban all references to winning. What the approach that we've taken in the guidance, and that's 6.2, financial concerns, is that we're looking here at potential problems with portrayals of rewards that aren't reasonable or are not indicative of what can be obtained through responsible play. So with lotteries, obviously there are a very few, very considerable prizes that can be won. And obviously lotteries are acknowledged as being a lower risk form of gambling. So there is perhaps more scope for lottery advertisers to accentuate those prizes. But again, they shouldn't go too far. I think what we're seeing though, or we have seen in quite a few ads over the years, is things like casino products where there are obviously lots of quite frequent stakes, frequent play, usually not for huge amounts of money, but the advertisement's really focusing in on the sort of the lifestyle, the boats, the houses, the glamour, etc., which the evidence suggests points towards higher risk patterns of play. So what we want to see is proportionality. Again, to stress, we're not looking to be completely cracking down on all references to winning or images of money or success at the table or whatever. What we're looking to do here is just insert a degree of proportionality, and I think I described them as sort of gratuitous descriptions or gratuitous depictions of wealth. That's where I think the ASA is likely to have a problem.
Okay, and another question from someone who'd quite like to understand more about how the guidance around urgent calls to action is likely to be dealt with. Is this likely to be enforced as a ban on bet or join now sort of claims across the board?
In short, I think no. Again, it's a question of proportionality. Firstly, we don't have the powers to go around banning specific claims and so forth. The key here is that there are certain situations when an advertisement could influence someone in a very strong way to participate when they have very little time to evaluate whether they should or shouldn't, basically to act on impulse. A lot of times, though, ads simply aren't going to do that. The ad is perhaps promoting a service which you can join at any particular point you choose or not choose to do, or alternatively a promotion which is open for, say, several days or something along those lines, where you can choose at that time, the time you see an ad, whether you want to participate or not. What we're talking about are very specific instances. So, for example, I think the example I gave during the slide was about half-time in football matches. There is a natural time constraint where anyone wanting to gamble on the second half has to get their bet in. An ad could unduly cause impulsiveness or an undue sense of urgency, and we think there is a risk there, and that's why we've put the guidance together to address that.
Thank you very much, Andy. That's really helpful to go through all that. And thank you for joining us. And if you'd like to, please carry on following us at cap_UK on Twitter, and keep an eye on our website and sign up to our newsletters for the further guidance that Andy discussed.